Welcome to our continued discussion of Western history. Today we're taking a look at the High Middle Ages. We've been looking at the High Middle Ages now for several sessions. This is a period in Western history that runs from about the year 1000 until around 1300 or 1350. We refer to it as the High Middle Ages to differentiate it from the Early Middle Ages and also the Late Middle Ages, which runs from about the year 1350 until whenever the Late Middle Ages stop, somewhere usually in the 16th century. I wanted to look first of all at political centralization in this period and talk to you for a little bit about an event that takes place in the High Middle Ages, the investiture controversy. And from there, we'll take a look at papal centralization and some of the reform movements that came as a result of this papal centralization and investiture controversy. Now, in the past, we've been talking about the rise of feudal Europe, what we've called feudal Europe, or sort of a second Europe characterized by decentralization of governments and the growth of local lay lords who basically formed local entities to ward off any threats, whether they be from the Norsemen in Scandinavia or wherever they came from. This decentralizing trend in Western Europe is something that you see from the end of the Carolingian period all the way through the Middle Ages, both the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages. One of the things that takes place, however, is that there is a growing political centralization in certain territories, namely in England, France, and in Germany. And what I mean by this is that while you have these feudal monarchies in these various locations, the people who called themselves kings in this feudal hierarchy gradually began to centralize power more and more, and they would become, in effect, what we would call today as nation states. Now, this would take many centuries to come to fruition, but we see the seeds of this happening in the High Middle Ages in places like England, France, and in Germany. In places like England with the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror, or Philip II, Philip Augustus in France, or the Hohenstaufens, Frederick I and Frederick II in Germany. These are all examples of kings who began to become more and more centralized. You still don't see quite the centralization that you saw under the Carolingians. But nevertheless, there is this growing political centralization as these kings, these feudal kings, gain more power by acquiring more land and gradually morph or gradually evolve into what we would call nation states in the early modern period. Now, one of the things that takes place in the High Middle Ages is a kind of church-state battle between the kings, these growing powerful kings of the High Middle Ages, and the popes, the church. After all, the two greatest powers in Western Europe in the High Middle Ages were the popes and the kings. Medieval society itself was structured according to three different distinct orders of society, different from modern-day classes, which are measured according to wealth. Orders are more organic elements of society. There were those who fight, the fighters, those who worked, that is, peasants, people who worked on the land, and those who prayed, that is, the clergy, both the regular clergy, monks and nuns, and what you would call secular clergy as well, bishops, priests, and deacons. And the ones with the most power, as I said, were the fighters, those who fight, the nobility, and the clergy, those who pray. The investiture controversy in the 11th and early 12th centuries was the first major ideological battle between these two great powers of Europe, the kings and the popes. And at stake in this battle was who was going to control it all. That is, who would control this entity that came to be referred to as Christendom, this religio-political kingdom, if you will. Now, since the days of Constantine and even our friend Charlemagne, the lords, the kings, and emperors had typically appointed bishops or abbots of monasteries and sometimes even parish priests. And if you think about it, this is problematic. It would be like in the modern day a mayor of a city appointing a pastor of a church, or the president of the United States appointing who would be the next bishop. So it's a real problem. But between 1050 and about 1100, this order of things would change radically. In fact, between 1050 and 1100, the whole conception of the world would really change, and it was an ideological revolution. It involved ideas. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that in this period of the High Middle Ages, the church-state dichotomy, which is so common in our day, that is, the separation of church and state, didn't really exist. Arguments were not about church and state as separate entities, but who gets the responsibility over it all. In other words, the church and state were two sides of the same coin. The only question would be who was the one that had the most power, who was over whom. Now, as I said, around the year 1000, it was customary that local rulers, whether these be kings, high on the feudal hierarchy, or perhaps even the lord of a manor, who himself was a fighter, a vassal in the feudal system, it was customary that these local rulers were in charge of the church. That is, they appointed bishops. If a monastery happened to be on their territory, they would often be involved in appointing the abbot of the monastery, and in some cases, even local parish priests. This was a period known as royal theocracy, that is, the divine right of king, something that we would know more about when we get to the early modern period. And the precedent for this royal theocracy is found in Old Testament kings like David and Solomon, who were, if you remember, anointed as kings. The point is that these kings were not believed to be ordinary people. They had more than just political or what we might call temporal control. They also had spiritual responsibilities. They were viewed in many ways as vicars or representatives of Christ. Now, you see this issue of royal theocracy on display in the ivory that's to your right of this slide. This is an ivory that goes back to the 10th century. It's found in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And it depicts the great King Otto the Great presenting the church to Christ, who's seated at the center. And you'll notice in this ivory that all of Jesus's attention is turned to his right. And of course, the right side is the seat of power. And Otto is there, and in his hands, he's presenting to Christ the church, and Christ is blessing it. So when you look at this image, the person that strikes you as being the most important figure in this image, apart from Jesus himself, is Otto the Great. To Jesus's left, you'll notice a guy carrying keys, and he has a tonsure on his head. That is a bald spot that indicates that he's part of the clergy. The keys give it away, of course, that he is the Pope. This is the Pope, carrying the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So this 10th century ivory depicts the notion of royal theocracy, where Jesus' attention is primarily toward the king. And the Pope is really, though important as a spiritual figure, in some regards is kind of secondary in this image. What changes this and brings about the investiture controversy is that the clergy, one of these orders of medieval society, had always believed that they were ultimately responsible not just for the spiritual well-being of the laity. The king, after all, is a layperson. But they were even responsible for making kings into kings. Again, remember our friend Charlemagne, who was anointed by the Pope. His father Pepin worked out that deal between the popes in Rome and the Franks, the Frankish papal alliance. And it was the Pope that made Pepin legitimate and ruler in Germany. So the popes had always believed, and the clergy had always believed, that they had the ultimate responsibility over the world. But in practical reality, that power, that authority fell to the lay lords, including kings. In the 11th century, that is around 1050, these two powerhouses would duke it out for control over the entire world, at least the world as it was conceived in those days. The protagonists in this battle were Pope Gregory VII and the German king Henry IV. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details about this battle between Pope and Emperor. It was a battle of words as opposed to a battle of arms. But in the end, the popes win control over their clergy. In other words, the Pope is able to restore his rightful claim to appoint his clergy, that is, bishops, priests, abbots of monasteries. The Pope regains the right to appoint the clergy. In fact, to this very day, when a pope dies or in recent history resigns from office, and there needs to be an election, it is the College of Cardinals that comes together and meets in the Sistine Chapel and decides who the next pope will be. And that process is a constitution, a process that started during the investiture controversy back in the 11th century. And what happens as a result of this papal reform is a whole series of religious reforms that literally take Europe by storm. We see in the wake of the investiture controversy the emergence of Christendom, this rather nebulous concept of a Christian kingdom, if you will, with the Pope as the person in charge of Christendom. Originally, the Pope was the Bishop of Rome and the heir of St. Peter and an important spiritual voice in the church, a very important spiritual voice in the church. But now he takes on the role of being more or less king of this Christian earthly empire. He now becomes the chief legislator. He issues decretals on all sorts of things, from marriage to inheritances to theology. He takes on international visibility. He establishes canon law. His court, the papal court, becomes the supreme court of the land. Virtually anything that gets done, anything that needs to be done, goes through the court of the papacy. Probably the best example of papal centralization in the wake of the investiture controversy is a guy like Pope Innocent III. He is one of the greatest of the medieval popes. He called councils. He started new religious orders. He called the Fourth Crusade. And he started a series of reforms that would have profound implications for Western Europe. Now, I might mention that papal centralization was extremely successful from about 1100 until about 1300. At that point, papal centralization begins to decline. a series of events take place in the late Middle Ages that cause the papacy and the Pope to lose prestige, as it were. Things like the Papal Schism, the Avignon Papacy, and then, of course, other unforeseen disasters like the Black Plague or the 100 Years' War. The papacy takes a turn that causes it to lose a lot of the prestige that it had in the High Middle Ages. But during this period, from 1100 to 1300, the papacy was at the height of its power. Now, I want to mention briefly some of the new religious ideals, both Orthodox ideals and heterodox ideals, that came out of the investiture controversy and characterized the High Middle Ages for years. First of all, one of the things that you see in this period is a greater emphasis on the New Testament. Now, it's not that people in the High Middle Ages discovered the New Testament for the first time, but there seems to have been a greater emphasis on the New Testament. Going back to the time of Charlemagne, the Franks, and even kings prior to the Carolingians, royal spirituality tended to come primarily from the Old Testament. In other words, kings like Charlemagne looked to the Old Testament for guidance on how to live their life as a Christian king. It's not that the New Testament didn't exist, but people like Charlemagne didn't really understand many of the ideals that you see in the New Testament. For example, things like love your enemy and turn the other cheek. These sorts of ideals would not have squared very well for the likes of a war hero like Charlemagne. But in the High Middle Ages, there's a new emphasis on the New Testament, a new emphasis on a personal and emotional religion. People began to take seriously the idea that Jesus suffered for sin. You can even see this, for example, in the way the crucifix is displayed. In the early Middle Ages, you often see Jesus portrayed on the cross in a rather king-like fashion. He is portrayed as a conqueror of sin, with a look of defiance, straight arms, and strong presence on the cross. Jesus comes across as an ideal conqueror of sin and death. With this new emphasis on the New Testament and a personal and emotional religion, people started to emphasize more the suffering Christ. You begin to see images of Jesus on the cross with blood. In this depiction here from the 12th century British Museum on the right-hand side, Jesus is clearly in a position of pain. He's suffering. His head is to the side. He has a look of suffering on his face. This becomes the way in which Christ is depicted. It's the image of the suffering Messiah from the book of Isaiah. Also along the lines with this new emphasis on the New Testament and a personal emotional religion, people become fascinated with the child Jesus. The fact that he was a little baby. He was helpless, if you will, in the arms of Mary and Joseph. He was a little child. This is the first time, for example, where you begin to see a Christmas creche being used. It was something that was developed by St. Francis of Assisi. But people were fascinated that Jesus was God, but he also became a little helpless, innocent child. The humility of the child Jesus was something that fascinated people in the High Middle Ages. There was also a great interest in the Virgin Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, her attributes, the fact that Jesus had a mother, and what that meant. You see this in sermons, in theology, in the way people understood the Bible, as they contemplated and thought about what it must have been like for the Blessed Virgin Mary to carry the Son of God in her womb. This completely fascinated people. Another element with this new emphasis on the New Testament and a personal emotional religion was the emphasis on the Eucharistic Christ. It was at the Fourth Lateran Council that the doctrine of transubstantiation was formalized and articulated in canon law, that Christ was truly, physically present in the Eucharist, that when the priest made the words of consecration and held up the host, people could worship it because it was, in fact, the body of Christ. This fascinated people, and you begin to see things like Corpus Christi plays and processions through streets. It was a really interesting period of religious devotion and fervor. The way in which this period is often summarized is that it was a period that emphasized the vita apostolica, that is, the life of the apostles. In other words, this was a period where people looked to the life of the apostles and tried to characterize how did they live. They came up with two important characteristics of the way in which apostles lived their lives. They lived their lives in poverty. That was the first one. And then the other element to the apostolic life was the life of preaching. So this period in the High Middle Ages, this religious reform sparked by the investiture controversy, was a period of explosion with regard to preaching and interpreting Scripture. It's also a period where you begin to see monastic orders begin to emphasize self-denial, asceticism, poverty, more than they had done in the past. Now, not only were there elements of orthodox popular religious revival in the High Middle Ages, there were also some examples of heterodox, that is, heretical examples of popular religious movements. Again, sparked by the investiture contest, papal reforms, monastic reforms, and this notion of the vita apostolica. One of these new heterodox movements were the Waldensians in France, named after Valdez in the 12th century, who was a merchant from Lyon. The Waldensians wanted vernacular scriptures, but they were denied by Pope Alexander III, they were denied a preaching license. And this is where they got into trouble with the Catholic Church. They were relatively orthodox in terms of their theology and their practice. But when they were denied the preaching license by Pope Alexander, they decided to rebel against that order, saying, "We will obey God rather than man." And heresy for the Waldensians becomes an act of disobedience to church authority. Later on, these Waldensians did take more of a serious heretical turn, but initially they were rebels who were trying, like the Franciscans, to live a life of poverty and preaching, but without the authority of the church. Now, other heretical movements were more doctrinally or theologically heretical, and the best case of this in the High Middle Ages were the Cathars or the Albigensians. They were called Albigensians from their location in southern France in the city of Albi. And the Cathars or Albigensians were a substantial threat to Catholic teaching and authority. This was a dualistic heresy, unlike the Waldensians, which tended to be more of a heresy of rebellion. The Cathars truly were a doctrinal heresy. They believed, for example, in two gods, similar to Gnostic beliefs of the early days of Christianity. They denied the physical world and attacked marriage and other central teachings of the Catholic Church. Innocent III issued a crusade against the Cathars, and they were eventually put down. But this, too, was an example of a movement that tried to exemplify the characteristics of the Vita Apostolica, a life of poverty and preaching, but they did it in a way that got themselves into trouble with church authority over their teaching. In addition to the heresies that emerged in the High Middle Ages, there were also some breaks from traditional ways of doing things, and one example was some new orders that emerged that challenged the old Benedictine way of monasticism. You remember St. Benedict of Nursia, the founder of Western monasticism. His rule and his way of doing things, his way of living the monastic life, was the dominant monastic life, for centuries. In the 12th century, though, some new orders emerged. These are legitimate orders that were sanctioned by the church, but they challenged the Benedictine way, usually on areas of either preaching or poverty. The Carthusians were one example of this, the regular canons, who were priests that tried to live a more monastic life, and especially the friars, both the Franciscans and Dominicans, took vows of poverty, spent their life preaching, and exemplified that vita apostolica better than anybody. St. Francis of Assisi is the best example of this, but also Dominic of Osma. These were two founders of the Franciscan order and the Dominican order. Both men, called to a life of poverty and preaching, developed orders that would explode in the High Middle Ages. And even to this day, both the Franciscans and the Dominicans are popular orders, houses of which are scattered throughout the United States and the rest of the world. Now, the Franciscans and Dominicans were different in some regards, but the friars in general had a few characteristics about them that should be noted. First of all, they were beggars. They were called mendicant friars. Absolute poverty is one of the things that governed the way they lived. In some cases, this poverty was meant to compete with heretical forms of poverty that you find both in the Cathars and in the Waldensians. But poverty was an important element to the life of a friar. Friars were mostly urban. They were great preachers and missionaries. They also served in universities. You remember when we talked about the rise of medieval universities, and I mentioned the great Thomas Aquinas, who was a university professor in Paris and also a Dominican friar. The friars were advisors to popes and kings. They supported the pope and generally served the church by living an active life out and among the people. This is what makes them somewhat unique and different from monks. Monks were cloistered. They were behind the walls of monasteries. Friars were out and about. They lived not the contemplative life of a monk, but the active life of a friar, working in schools, hospitals, being out among the people, and yet still having some of those characteristics of the monastic life, following a rule, living in community, and serving the communities in which they lived. So the High Middle Ages represents an important change. It represents the centralization of political power in the hands of kings and emperors. It also represents a period where two of the most important orders of medieval society, that is, kings on the one hand and the church on the other, had something of an ideological war as to who would be on top of the social hierarchy. And for the period between 1100 and 1300, the power that rose to the top was the church. It reformed itself, it elected its own bishops, appointed clergy, appointed abbots, and as a result of this top-level reform, we begin to see a religious revival in the High Middle Ages that was truly remarkable. It found its way into every level of society. Monks reformed, even kings and the nobility reformed. The Crusades, which were a unique element of the High Middle Ages, came about as a result of this religious reform movement. A greater emphasis on the New Testament, the suffering Christ, the vita apostolica, inspired hosts of people, men and women alike, to join monasteries, to become Franciscan or Dominican friars, to become Carthusian monks or Augustinian canons. Virtually every level of society was affected by this religious revival. It is truly a unique period in the history of Western Europe. Next time, we'll take a look at the late Middle Ages. In particular, we'll take a look at the Italian Renaissance. And so until then, I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you back here next time.